So hello, everybody. My name is Tim Smith, and I'm the historian here at the Adams County Historical Society. And you probably know that we offer free programs most Saturdays throughout the year. So we started, when we first opened, we did a few programs a week, and now we just kind of honed it down to every Saturday morning around 11 o'clock during the regular part of the year. We do programs that you can attend. And we do a variety of programs, and we announce them ahead of time on our Facebook and social media, and of course on our website. And you might know, of course, during the anniversary every year, we in the past we had done this. Now that we have a new museum, we are going to provide historical content that people can come to the society and learn more about different topics. And we're doing the Union Advance today and the Confederate Retreat next week. And my program on the Confederate Retreat is pretty much very detailed in the actions that occurred during the retreat in Adams County. So it's a pretty concise program of a part of the Confederate Retreat that's not discussed a lot in books on the retreat from Gettysburg. So I'm not going to delve into the, things that happened like in Hagerstown or Williamsport. It's going to be like Adams County associated during the retreat. But today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the advance of the Union Army to the battlefield. And in this program, I'm not going to talk about the entire advance or the specifics of the advance. It's more of my thoughts on the Union advance, things I don't normally talk about in these programs. And I'm specifically going to talk about, the Union advance from Frederick, Maryland, into Pennsylvania. So just that small part of it. Oh, let me go back. So even before the first shots of the battle on the morning of July 1st, the commanders of both armies were preparing for a speedy concentration once the battle was joined. In a letter to President Jefferson Davis on July 4th, 1863, Confederate General Robert E. Lee stated that soon after intelligence was received that the army of General Hooker was advancing, the whole force was directed to concentrate at Gettysburg. I always find that interesting because obviously the story is a little more complicated than that, but on July 4th, that is what Robert E. Lee wrote, that they were concentrating at Gettysburg as soon as he heard that Hooker was moving northward. In a dispatch to General Reynolds just before the battle, Union General George Gordon Meade stated that if they advance against me, I must concentrate at that point where they show the strongest force. And throughout the days prior to the battle, soldiers of both armies trudged along the roads that led to Gettysburg. The movements of these troops resulted in one of the bloodiest actions in American history. And in the case of the Army of the Potomac, the Union Army, one might argue that the speed with which the troops marched was a critical factor in the Union victory at Gettysburg, especially the speed at which they arrived here after the first shots were fired and the way that General Meade was able to concentrate his force quickly after the battle started. And of course, that concentration led to the Northern Army having a strong position on Cemetery Hill on the morning of July 2nd, which actually led directly to the Northern victory. And I think there's a few things I'll talk about throughout the program. I think this is lost on a lot of people. Now, I would argue that once the battle is underway, that it's the Southern Army that moves slow and doesn't concentrate very well. And it's the Northern Army that conducts this massive concentration and suddenly appears on the battlefield in force. And that might surprise a lot of people to hear that, because usually General Meade is perceived as the person who moves slower and more cautiously. And definitely during this period, this is not the case. In their post-war reminiscence, I should say, many of the soldiers themselves reached this conclusion of the importance of the march. Lieutenant William Hemingway of the 18th Massachusetts and the 5th Army Corps wrote that the march from Falmouth to Gettysburg was fully equal to any effort that would be required to face the enemy in battle. Indeed, this march may well be considered as no small part of the victory which was won on the soil of the Keystone State. And of course, I've always believed this. Maybe some of it has to do with the fact that I lived along Big Pipe Creek on the route of march of the Northern Army. And that was, my first perspective of this. And I think that this aspect of the campaign, when you read about the battle, is kind of considered boring. And, for that first part, maybe that's one of the reasons it's unappreciated. Especially this is true that it's ignored when we're assessing the efficiency of the commanding generals of the Army. There's no doubt that Robert E. Lee is one of the greatest generals in American history, but too often people qualify whether you're a good general or not on your decisions made in the battle. Like, I would suggest that Robert E. Lee is a little bit too aggressive, and I would suggest that sending troops across an open field under cannon fire to attack Cemetery Ridge was a bad idea. I don't know why some people have trouble admitting that. But I consider Robert E. Lee a great general because the man moved 70,000 men 200 miles. Can you imagine everything that's involved in moving an army of such a large size and making sure they're supplied with provisions as they go along? Of course, the Southerners are gathering up supplies and provisions also, but that is just a massive movement. And of course, General Meade, in 3 days, took control of the army and moved his army so aggressively as to cut into Lee's army without giving him time to react or fully concentrate. And I believe this moment, which caught Lee off guard, was greatly responsible for the Northern victory. Let's see. Oh, let me go to the next slide. So let's talk a little bit about General Joseph Hooker. And, I think General Hooker did a great job of moving the Northern Army at the outset of the campaign through Northern Virginia and over the Potomac River into the area of Frederick, Maryland. On June 26th and June 27th, Hooker has a plan. Now, if you read Edwin Coddington, the Gettysburg Campaign, A Study in Command, he says that, trying to figure out exactly what Hooker's plan is might be kind of difficult from the available sources because, of course, Hooker is going to resign and is not going to be part of what ends up being the Battle of Gettysburg. But Hooker's plan sort of scares the authorities in Washington. And Hooker's plan basically is to move into Maryland, across the Potomac River, and his concentration seems to be to western Maryland, into the Cumberland Valley. And he would like to cut off Lee's line of supplies and communications. And, you know, of course, Hooker will get into just an argument with Henry Halleck over the use of the troops at the Harper's Ferry garrison, and that would ultimately lead to his resignation. But Hooker would like to take the 12th Army Corps, the Harper's Ferry garrison, throw them into the Cumberland Valley, or below it into Maryland, above Harper's Ferry. He even mentions in one of the dispatches that he wants to send a force, apparently of infantry, out to Williamsport and destroy the Confederate pontoon bridges and such. Now, of course, it would be better, cavalry would be better used for that purpose, because it would take a long time for the Union infantry to march over there and march back. But as Hooker is obsessed with the area west of Frederick, the Union authorities are authorities in Washington are obsessed with the defense of Baltimore and Washington. And you also need to consider, while Hooker is coming up with this master plan, in theory, to cut off Lee's lines of supplies and communications, force Lee to pull back down into Maryland and then swing around with the rest of his army and attack him, the situation, the strategic situation dramatically changed while he was coming up with this plan. And I don't think a lot of people consider this. When he comes up with the plan, the Southern Army is in the Cumberland Valley between Hagerstown and Chambersburg. And during the 26th and the 27th, the Southern Army marched across Adams County and York County, and by June 28th, they're at Wrightsville. And the Rhodes Division of Ewell's Corps, of course, marched up the valley, captured Carlisle, and was threatening the defenses of Harrisburg. And so now the Southern invasion is much more oriented to the east. And of course, Jeb Stuart will cross between the Northern Army and Washington, D.C., and ride around the Northern Army into Pennsylvania. And so the federal authorities' attention is focused on the fact that the Southern Army seems to be moving east around Hooker and could possibly attack Baltimore and Washington. And part of the reason, that Hooker may resign, some of this is our opinion or guesswork, is that his strategic plan is kind of been thrown out the window because, Hooker depends upon Lee wanting to fall back and try to keep him from cutting off his line of retreat and his line of supplies and communications. And Hooker would have to move over the mountains, the Catoctin Mountains, the South Mountains, and into the area behind Lee to facilitate this. And then he had to make a lot of noise. Hey, I'm cutting off your line of retreat. Stop, turn, attack me. And the evidence, is debatable whether this movement would have forced Lee's hand. And of course, what the authorities in Washington and Baltimore fear, that Lee will say, oh, you pulled troops west, huh? Let me swing around now and hit Baltimore. And so there's this conflict. And the conflict between Abraham Lincoln, Edwin Stanton, Henry Halleck, and General Hooker, of course, stems from their lack of confidence in Hooker because of the previous campaign. And it's only amplified by Henry Halleck's perceived failure of Hooker to hold the Northern Army in Northern Virginia and keep them from getting over into the valley where they captured Winchester. So the debacle at Winchester is fresh in everybody's mind. So Hooker doesn't really know what to do. And then Henry Halleck, of course, hits him with the fact that, I'm sorry, even though we told you that you could be in charge of the troops as you move forward at the garrison of Harper's Ferry, we've decided that we will not allow you to pull those troops out of the garrison of Harper's Ferry. And so on June 27th at 8:30 p.m., General Hooker sends a dispatch to Washington announcing that he is going to resign. And it's interesting when you think about the way things worked out. Hooker that day had been in Harper's Ferry talking to the garrison commander. He had already alerted them to get ready to march because he was going to include them in his army as he was marching forward. And then he gets to Frederick, and at Frederick there's a railroad to Washington, D.C., and there's a telegraph. Of course, we're talking about the B&O Railroad, and then you go into what the junction just south of Baltimore, and then down. But there's a telegraph, and he can quickly get a message to Washington, so it's not too far away. And there's a great chapter in Edwin Connington's A Study in Command, and I'd urge people who are interested in this subject to read this simple explanation of the problems between Halleck and Hooker and how this resignation takes place. Some people over the years have suggested that the administration goaded Hooker into his resignation. And then, of course, when they got his resignation, they were like, yes! Now, because it allowed the administration to replace Hooker without it seeming like it was their fault. There's nothing we could do. He just resigned. I don't know. So we'll just appoint somebody else. And then but Connington comes to the conclusion, when you look at it in great detail and examine some of the movements that Hooker is continuing to make on the 28th as he's resigning, that maybe this is all just a big bluff. Maybe Hooker believes that there's no way they're going to accept his resignation in the middle of such a critical moment in the Gettysburg campaign, and that they're going to be forced to give in and give him the troops at Harper's Ferry. Like they're going to come back and say, oh, don't resign. Here, you can have those troops. But make no doubt about it, it was Hooker who initiated this and who resigned. And you read the account, and my suggestion to Hooker was, you should have said, you give me those troops or I resign. But he didn't. He said, I resign. You didn't give me those troops I wanted. They should have reversed those sentences a little bit. Because they accept his resignation. And at first, I think he's surprised. But according to the account, there's some indication that Hooker learns that a special messenger has been sent to Frederick on a train, and he's at Meade's headquarters. And then he realizes, they're going to accept my resignation. So I think his name is William J. Hardy, is dispatched from Washington, D.C. And again, Frederick, Maryland is close to Washington, D.C. by rail. Boy, Hooker's making it convenient for them to replace him. And so he rides by rail. I think he reaches Meade's headquarters at 3 a.m. on the 28th, so Sunday, June 28th. Now, when they get to Meade's headquarters, the headquarters were located south of Frederick, kind of southwest, I guess, along the Buckeystown Road, which is now 85, alongside Bollinger Creek. I wanted to mention that, there is a statue. It was placed there in 1930. It was rededicated again in 1963 at the 100th anniversary of the event. And also I should mention that it's moved several times because now, I think to get to it, last time I went to it, you had to pull onto an off-ramp of Route 15 to get to it, if I remember correctly. But you can still see it, though. It's still near the site, but it's not at the site where Meade was given command of the Army. It was the site where Joseph Hooker's headquarters were located. So upon General Meade learning that he was taking command of the army, and because there's lots of neat stories about that, I won't get into that. He goes to Hooker's headquarters to meet with Hooker. And he talks to Hooker for a few minutes. And I'm sure Hooker gave him his version of why he resigned from the army. Meade and Hooker are not friends. Meade said that up until this point, he had not been informed of Hooker's plans in any way, shape, or form. And Meade insists that at this meeting before Hooker left, Hooker supplied him with no concept of what Hooker was going to do or what he had planned to do. I should mention that the Northern Army had marched a considerable distance in the days prior to reaching Frederick, Maryland. And so when they reached Frederick, Maryland, June 28th was already set aside by General Hooker as a day of rest for the Army. Now, there were some movements on June 28th. One of them was that they decided to pull the 12th Army Corps and the Union cavalry out from the western area of Maryland, where Hooker had thrown them across to act as a blocking force, and move them towards Frederick also. And it seems like Hooker initiated this, which tells me that Hooker realizes that because the Southerners are now marching towards the Susquehanna River, his plans for that whole cutting off their lines of supplies and the trouble he was getting from Washington, he's kind of realized that's not going to happen. But Meade does learn from Hooker, exactly where the different elements of the army are located and where they're moving. And then he starts initiating his own command. You probably know that he appoints several staff officers to help him with the Army command, but he decides to keep Daniel Butterfield the chief of staff. And it wasn't out of goodwill. He was thinking about replacing him with, there's 3 other people he talked to that day about replacing him. But he ends up leaving Daniel Butterfield, Hooker's chief of staff, in place, which will come to haunt him after the battle when Butterfield is testifying before the committee of the conduct of the war and says all kinds of negative things about Meade at Gettysburg. But one thing I wanted to mention, before I move on, is that 2 things about Hooker are interesting. After Hooker resigns and Hooker's place, in the Gettysburg campaign, in post-war years is being written about, Hooker insists that he had a plan, and he insists that he did a pretty good job. And 2 things he likes to insist, and some of the Alfred Pleasonton, head of the Union cavalry, doesn't really support him in this, but it was Hooker's moving forward sent orders to General French, who was in charge of troops at Frederick, to send cavalry forces forward towards Adams County and York County to try to figure out where the Southern Army is located. And also, he sends the Michigan Cavalry Brigade under Joseph Copeland to Gettysburg to survey the situation. And I think one of the reasons that this story is not so well told, Copeland does ride to Gettysburg on June 28th. He does talk to a bunch of people about the situation. Dave McConaughey provides him valuable information. And he returns to Frederick, but on his way, he runs into a messenger around the time he sees the 1st Army Corps that he's been relieved of command. And, of course, George Armstrong Custer will be given command of his brigade. And so you don't hear much about Joseph Copeland, but he was in charge of the elements of the Northern Army that first reached Gettysburg 2 days prior to John Beaufort. And the second thing Hooker would like is, Hooker takes from that he's the one who ordered the Northern Army to Gettysburg. And then Hooker had sent an order to Alfred Pleasonton prior to his resignation that General Buford, or elements of Pleasonton's command, should be sent forward to Gettysburg. And this definitely resulted in Buford being sent to Gettysburg and arriving here on June 30th. So Copeland and Buford's commands came here because of Hooker prior to Meade taking command. And I think that's all fair with Hooker. Believe me, he'll get bashed enough. Okay. And today, people, many people just suggest that Hooker really had no plan. It's interesting, the first time I was down to see this marker for where, Meade took command from Hooker in Frederick, Maryland, there's this plaque on the side of the boulder. I don't think people make a big deal out of this the way I do. But I am sure that if you walk south of Devil's Den, there's a quarry and you can see a big empty spot where a big block of stone was taken out of. I'm sure it's my imagination. I told my friend Gary that we should measure the marks, see the chisel marks along the bottom, and see if I can match those exact distances up with chisel marks in a rock at Devil's Den. But I love that. So it's taken from a point near Devil's Den. That's great stuff. I don't know if you saw my Monuments Monday video last week where I did the 26th Pennsylvania Emergency Regiment, and I found an article that the boulder that statue sits on is from Little Round Top. Yeah. The monument to where the 5th New Hampshire, where Edward Cross fell, those rocks come from different areas of the battlefield. I think one from Little Round Top, one from Culp's Hill. But they put the monument together with rocks from different places on the battlefield. So if you see a photograph with a rock in it and that rock's no longer there, yeah, I don't think we can make too many guesses. But, I got to tell you that I just saw this meme. This was on Addressing Gettysburg yesterday. So I don't know who did it. Does it say? Oh, somebody made it with Mematic, it says. But I don't know. The person it is not here, are they? Because obviously it's a friend of Matt Calorie, and it was on Addressing Gettysburg. But it's a good meme, because when Meade takes command, he gets a general order from Henry Halleck, and it basically says, I want you to move into position to defend Baltimore and Washington, and then at the same time move forward and defeat Robert E. Lee in battle. I mean, it's just really simple. So the thing Meade does is he shifts the army eastward so he can be in a position to block a southern advance on Baltimore, Washington. And that is an important key to, facilitating these orders that he has to. And, we may look at it like the authorities in Washington, I say, Abraham Lincoln, Edwin Stanton, Henry Halleck, they are obsessed with the defense of Washington. And sometimes their obsession maybe interferes with the ability of General Hooker or General Meade to move to move of their own free will. They're always tied down to this. But, we need to consider that Washington, D.C. is like the symbol of the North. And there's just no way that we can allow the Southern Army to attack or capture it. And you gotta keep the Southerners away from it. I mean, can you imagine Washington, D.C. being in a place where all the diplomats from all the other countries in the world are, there, and what would people say if Washington, D.C. got captured by the Southern Army? So I think that they over-dramatize the threat on Washington often during the Civil War. And it does have a ring of forts around it. And if their troops of the Northern Army fall back into those forts, it would be, the most heavily defended city in history up until that time. But, I guess it is necessary. So I got to tell you, I don't know when I first started to appreciate General Meade's role, but he's put in a very difficult place. He wasn't asked to take command of the Army. He was ordered to take command of the Army. He wasn't really given a choice. And, he did take command. There was some negative reaction to his taking of command. And I'm always interested in this when I pick up a book. Who will they cite as a source for the Union Army's reaction to General Meade taking command? Did they do it from a friend of General Hooker's perspective? The friends of General Hooker are horrified but they don't know right away that Hooker resigned, and that Hooker initiated this. They're thinking that Hooker was tricked into resigning or that he was fired, really. And I got to tell you, have you read a book where they say General Hooker was fired prior to the battle? A lot of general books on the Civil War say that he got fired, not that he resigned. And then, of course, there's the Third Corps, because, I'll go way out on a limb with my crazy theories, because, we all have crazy theories. We just don't all admit that they're crazy theories, right? My crazy theory is that Hooker resigns and Sickles knows that his time is limited. He's going to be out of there. Because one thing, if you read anything about Meade, he does not tolerate stupidity. So I insist that Sickles' forward movement on July 2nd is done because he needs to be the hero of the battle, because he knows he's out of there no matter what. So that's just crazy, I know. And, also, a lot of the negative criticism about General Meade comes from people that really don't know him, because he's not a well-known figure. He's not a flashy figure. He's not one who seeks attention. And so people are like, who's this Meade guy? I love the Killer Angels when this is discussed in the middle or the beginning of the book. And one of the prisoners of the 2nd Maine, I think in the movie Buckland, is talking to Jeff Daniel. And he says, that these generals in the Army, and I always think about Hooker when he says this, couldn't pour piss out of a boot with the instructions on the heel. And I've often thought about, going to the t-shirt shop and getting a t-shirt made with Hooker's picture on it and the statement. So I think that would be great. I say it's about, in the novel when he says it about all the generals of the Army of Potomac, and he mentions, this latest idiot Meade. So I just think it's a general statement about how the soldiers in the Army don't necessarily trust the men in command of the Army. But again, Meade hasn't been given a chance. One interesting thing, though, is if you take just the accounts of the 5th Army Corps, who Meade commanded the 5th Army Corps, when they learn that Meade has taken command of the Army, they're very happy. And just a couple quotes. Here's the history of the 155th Pennsylvania. The 5th Corps was particularly elated in that their general should be selected for the high command. The 5th Corps correspondent, they have correspondents of the various newspapers traveling with the elements of the Army. The 5th Corps correspondent with the New York Herald was present when Meade took command. He said, and this is right afterwards, General Meade, on receiving notification of his appointment as the head of the Army, was evidently taken by surprise. He enters on his new duties as a matter of course, and yet with modesty and, I believe, full confidence in his abilities to rightly fill the place. This Corps certainly has entire confidence in his capacity for any military position that can be given to him. And with this confidence, inspired by the able and brilliant manner in which he has led them in the engagements in which he has been their leader. So that's kind of interesting, a contemporary account from someone who's there with the 5th Corps. According to Sergeant Andrew Morrison of the 9th Pennsylvania Reserves, here we learned, meaning in Frederick, of the appointment of General Meade to command of the Army of the Potomac. Great news for us of the Pennsylvania Reserve Corps. We were proud to know that one of our generals, one for whom we felt that we had won the stars, should be placed in the very highest position in the Army at the very crisis of the nation's fate. And I think that's kind of interesting. And the situation when he takes command, all day long on June 28th, he makes preparations for the march on June 29th. And I should mention that in Hooker's plans prior to him resigning, there's no indication that he's going to order a march on June 29th. And this becomes important when we consider that on the evening of June 28th, Robert E. Lee, outside of Chambersburg, has received word that the Northern armies have reached Frederick, and that, they're only, 30 miles, 35 miles away from Gettysburg. So that will force Lee to order for the concentration of his army. And I would argue that if Hooker had not resigned and not been relieved, that the Union Army might not move forward on June 29th on a wide march such as Meade's going to order. That Hooker had wanted a couple days to facilitate some kind of new plan because his old plan has kind of been disrupted. And if the Northern Army doesn't move on June 29th, then the Southern Army concentrate, whether it be Gettysburg or Cashtown, and then as the Northern Army does eventually move forward, they have to deal with the concentrated Southern forces in Pennsylvania. So General Meade takes command, organizes his troops. He actually separates them into wings, and one of the wings will be turned over to one of his best friends, General John Fulton Reynolds. And I don't think that we can overestimate the relationship between General Meade and General Reynolds in the days that led to the battle. We all know General Reynolds had been offered command of the Army of the Potomac on June 2nd, according to the best sources. He was called to Washington, D.C. He was offered command, but he turned it down. And, there were lots of reasons that he turned it down, maybe because he just didn't want it. But he believed that the administration was meddling too much in the Army commander's affairs. When I say that, I mean with Hooker. And so at some point on the 28th, Reynolds rides into Meade's camp, and they have a discussion. And of course, Meade, I forget exactly where the source is. Maybe it's Reynolds' staff officer who writes about it later, says that at that meeting on June 2nd, Reynolds told Abraham Lincoln that if he was in a jam, he should appoint General Meade as commander of the Army. So here comes Reynolds in the headquarters, and Meade and Reynolds talk. And boy, would you like to be a fly on the wall during that conversation. As a result of the meeting, Reynolds will be placed as a wing commander. And Reynolds will assist Meade in any way he can. And it'll be Reynolds that will be placed in charge of the troops that is marching closest to Lee's army in the Cumberland Valley. And it will be him that will initiate the battle on July 1st. Now, I say this knowing that there's at least 2 modern books that have this crazy assertion, and again, it's a crazy idea, but they won't admit it, that that Reynolds doesn't like General Meade. And General Meade, or General Reynolds, disobeys Meade's orders and brings on the battle without him knowing it to force that coward Meade to come forward. And these things in these books offend me and my sensibilities. So you get this really, and there's only a couple books that have brought that up. And again, their evidence for that is non-existent. So General Meade, his army is around Frederick, Maryland, and he will move his army forward on the morning of June 29th. So, according to, before we get that, the ambitious marching orders issued over the next few days well illustrate General Meade's resolve in bringing Lee's army to battle. But it was up to the individual men in the ranks to execute these forced marches. According to General Meade himself, in his address to the Army of the Potomac when he took over, the country looks to this army to relieve it from the devastation and disgrace of a hostile invasion. Whatever fatigues and sacrifices we may be called upon to undergo, let us have in view constantly the magnitude of the interest involved, and let each man determine to do his duty. So there's a little speech he gives. The orders for march were just designed so that the various elements of the army could move north on parallel routes. And again, I mentioned they're going to march slightly to the east because they want to get into position to really defend the approaches to Baltimore and Washington. According to General Meade's son, in the book that was published about Meade's memoirs, having perfected his plans, Meade issued to the army the order of march the following day. The orders dated June 28th and directed the 1st Corps to Lewistown, the 2nd Corps to Frizzelburg, the 3rd Corps to Taneytown, the 5th Corps to Uniontown, the 6th Corps to New Windsor, and the 12th Corps to Taneytown. Is that good? Oh, and I forgot the 11th Corps to Emmitsburg. So here's kind of a map of the area that we're talking about between Frederick and Gettysburg. And basically, his army will move on several parallel routes, sort of to the northeast. Let's see, I don't know what I put in next. Okay, this is from Civil War Trails, and this kind of gives you an idea. The 6th Corps being thrown way out to the right, on June 29th, the movements of the Army and the various elements of the Army. And, some people talk about this. Maybe some people haven't thought about it. You don't have the Army all marching on one road because that would be scattered out, really far. Throughout the early stages of the campaign, Meade has a plan for each day that allows him to be able to concentrate the force quickly if the battle occurs at any of these locations. And again, some people are suggesting that the Southern Army is moving in force towards York, Pennsylvania, and it might be swinging down into the east. So getting to, an area such as Manchester might be very important to cut off that. And, some people believe that Jeb Stuart, riding behind the Northern Army, is going to meet this force coming south out of York, and that then they might attack Baltimore. And, it would be interesting also, because when we're talking about this, I bet you're thinking about Meade on June 28th at his headquarters by himself, scouring over the maps and trying to come up with a plan. But should we mention that at his headquarters, there are hundreds of dispatches arriving every few minutes from everyone and their brother, giving him exact information as to the whereabouts of the Confederate Army. They're over here. No, they're here. They're over here. There's thousands of them here. The governor of Pennsylvania is sending dispatches at an incredible rate. One thing also you probably know is that at some point, I think it's on June 28th, the Jeb Stuart cuts the telegraph line between Frederick and Washington, D.C. I have to think, in the bigger scheme of things, that helped General Meade. And the story that Hooker hangs out all day on June 28th, and he leaves that night to go back to, on the railroad towards Baltimore, Washington. And when he gets close to Ridgeville near Mount Airy, if you know where that is in southern Carroll County, Jeb Stuart is passing through, and Hooker is almost captured. Wouldn't that have been great? But Hooker, it is, the railroad's cut off, and they have to avoid capture there. I think that's fascinating. Okay. So here's kind of an idea of the march of June 29th. And let's see, I talked about that. Now the First Corps, again, will be sent to the left, and they're kind of acting as a wing. So in that corps, we had the First Corps, the 11th Corps, the Third Corps, and John Buford's Union Cavalry Division will be out ahead of that corps. Of course, that's another story of how they end up getting into Gettysburg. But according to Charles Carleton Coffin, who was a correspondent with the Army at the time, he says, right after the battle, he wrote about it. On June 29th, the 1st and 11th Corps were directed up the Monocacy Valley on the west side of the stream through Mechanicstown, which is Thurmont, and Emmitsburg towards Gettysburg. Their line of march was direct and therefore shorter than the routes of the other corps. The Catoctin Range was a wall to them all the way, preventing Lee from making a counter movement and attacking their flank, and except where the gaps are. And if you read about John Fulton Reynolds, when he does reach Emmitsburg, he is very concerned about the gap in the mountain from Emmitsburg that leads over the mountain into the Cumberland Valley, and has patrols making sure the Southerners aren't marching through that gap. The 2nd and the 5th Corps were made the center columns, and they were thrown across the Monocacy east 3 miles from Frederick and marched northeast and eventually through Union, they mean Uniontown, to Frizzleburg. They didn't make it to Frizzleburg, we'll talk about. I think it's interesting that in a lot of these articles concerning the campaign, there's a mention that General Meade's headquarters is going to be in Frizzleburg. And I think on the night of June 30th. Meade never goes to Frizzleburg. And I've been to Frizzleburg. I lived near Frizzleburg. I used to stop at the little store there. No one wants to go to Frizzleburg. Let me just tell you that. So one of my favorite little towns on the Gettysburg campaign. But they end up not going to Frizzleburg. Oh, good. Where's Frizzleburg on the map? Good question. Because obviously it's not going to be shown. But it's about halfway, let's see, it's just south there. It's like right there between Westminster, Maryland and Taneytown on the old Taneytown Road, not the modern 140 that goes out through there. So that let's everybody put down on your list to visit Frizzleburg. Hey, you have to be trying to visit. You wouldn't just pass through it. Okay. I like that. Okay. So on just a couple odds and ends, let me tell you one story before I move to that. Okay. Oh, Charles Carleton Coffin mentioned that the line of march were like the sticks of a fan, Frederick being the point of radiation. That's pretty good, isn't it, for a guy who's with the Army? Now, he's only with one element of it, and he doesn't know that the Union headquarters aren't in Frizzleburg. But he gives you a good idea of it. According to General Meade, the march was disagreeable on the 29th and fatiguing owing to a drizzling rain and very bad conditions of the roads. The general advance of the Army was 20 miles that day. And I look at what happened on June 29th, and I'm like, wow. You moved into the exact position you needed to move into in one day. And then you could formulate some kind of plan of what you were going to do. I just think it's incredible. But Meade was not satisfied. Some of the units did not reach their intended destination that day. And of course, he was upset with certain of the Corps commanders and let them know it. And, you know, I don't know why, but when we talk about General Meade, it seems like when he's angry and shooting off these angry dispatches, people think that's a negative thing. He's mean. He's an old, snapping turtle. But I think that's what, they needed at this moment. Of course, during the March to Gettysburg, General Sickles will come under his ire. And, of course, that's going to not result well and, when the battle occurs. And, there's a lot of negativity. But on June 29th, I was going to jump and talk about this first. I'm sorry. For the men of the 2nd Army Corps, the morning of June 29th would mark the beginning of one of the severest tests endured during their entire service. Before settling into camp early the next morning of the 30th, the men would march through Liberty, Johnsville, Union Bridge, and Uniontown. And I think this is interesting. I shot this map at Union Bridge. And so they show, you were here, they show the 2nd Army Corps reaching Union Bridge, but they moved to Uniontown and they camped here that night. Remember, they're supposed to go to Frizzleburg, but they stopped in Uniontown that night. Okay? Depending on the units where the march started, it is estimated in the various regimental counts that they marched 30 to 40 miles that day. And I'm going to say, conservatively, it's 32 miles. Can you imagine walking 32 miles? Josiah Fayville of the 57th in New York, who was on Samuel Zook's staff, said he recalled it as the longest and most severe march in the 2nd Corps' history. The command marched at 6 a.m. We passed through Liberty and Johnsville to Uniontown, a distance of 30 miles. Some say 35. The roads were good but fearfully dusty. And some people say it rains on them, and some people say it did rain on them. I love that. Depends where you are, right? It's a large area. We rested occasionally, perhaps 3 hours all told, and went into bivouac in fair condition, although there were many stragglers. According to Colonel Franklin Sawyer of the 8th Ohio, this was by far the most fatiguing march made by the regiment during the entire war. And, it's always interesting when you look at the different units and look in their regimental histories for the day that they think they made the longest march. Because guides are fine to saying this was the most miles marched in a single day by la, 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 la. And usually we say that without knowing and checking all the other, marches. Interestingly, the 11th Army Corps, their record march during the campaign, the longest march, was like 35 miles on July 7th during the pursuit. I always think that's interesting when people say they didn't pursue. Hey, well, what about this unit marched at 35 miles? And this is from Franklin Sawyer said, starting from Monocacy before daylight, the march continued for 24 hours without hardly a moment's halt until we lay down almost in our tracks at Uniontown. We had marched 35 to 40 miles. The day was intensely hot, and numerous little creeks and streams, swollen by recent rains, had to be forded, sometimes deep. But the men said the bath cooled them off, and besides, the march always slows up at a ford. Let's see. So then, fortunately for the 2nd Army Corps, though, they got to rest on June 29th. I wanted to mention it. Meade himself, on June 29th, camped at Middleburg. And again, this is a place where you have to be trying to find it to go there. If you drive south from Taneytown to Frederick, on 194, I believe it is, this is in Carroll County before you pass into Frederick County. But you'd have to get off the road and go to the left on one of the various roads to find Middletown. And there is an Army of the Potomac marker in front of a much more recent house in the middle of the little town talking about the movements there. We have accounts of Meade's encampment, and that marker I just showed in Middletown is like right there. There is a road that comes up over Big Pipe Creek that goes directly to Taneytown, and then the modern Route 15, I think it comes down right through here, somewhere in there. You'd have to turn off of it and go over to Middletown. But I think it's clear in the accounts that General Meade camps on the Coon Farm. And whether it's on that side of the road or the one on this side of the road, I guess it's debatable. When I was up there, I thought right there was a great spot for him to have his headquarters and camp. And the camp is right along Big Pipe Creek, which, as General Meade is moving forward, he feels like they have to have a plan in case the Southern Army attacks, or in case he get close to draw them into an attack. So he positions the army from Middleburg across Uniontown and out towards Manchester and through Union Mills with the intention of putting the army on top of the banks along Pipe Creek. And I got to tell you, when I was I guess from like I was 12 until close to 30, I lived along Big Pipe Creek. So I lived in a house on a hill with a field out in front leading to Big Pipe Creek. And I could see the Southerners crossing the creek and charging across the field up the slopes where my house would be in artillery position. And General Eisenhower had read about this, and General Eisenhower visited Union Mills not far from my house when he was retired here. And he is quoted as saying, like, wow, this is a strong position. They're not hitting this position. I think it's fascinating that as Meade's forces are moving forward and he's directing all these troops on all these different roads, he has time to have his engineers go out along Big Pipe Creek. And again, he's camped right at Big Pipe Creek. But he's got this time for his engineers to find out what the possibilities would be for forming a defensive position along this line. Now, you all know that the Pipe Creek Circular will be issued on the morning of July 1st. And if anything, it just confused the commanders that got it, because July 1st is when the Battle of Gettysburg is just getting underway. One thing I do marvel at, though, is General Meade had just issued this circular, and when he finds out from a staff officer from Reynolds that the Battle of Gettysburg is beginning, and General Reynolds suggests he ordered the concentration of the Northern Army at Gettysburg, he scraps the Pipe Creek plan immediately and issues orders for everyone to march to Gettysburg. And I think that's overlooked because, one of these more pompous commanders might have wanted to hang with his plan that he just issued and not see the logic in what Reynolds was stating to Meade. So that's just a thought I always seem to have. On June 30th, I should mention, the next night, Meade will camp near Taneytown, just north of Taneytown, and there's a marker put up by the state of Maryland Historical Society, that he camped near the Shunk Farm, which I guess would be off to the right of the road, an old farmhouse or something, or on the property of the farmhouse. But this is just outside of Taneytown, not on the road to Gettysburg, but on the road to Littlestown. And this is where he'll be when he receives word on the morning of July 1st, from General Reynolds that the battle has started and he needs the order for the army to concentrate. Of course, he will send General Hancock north to Gettysburg to make sure that that's what they want to do. But eventually this will result in the concentration of the army. And here's just a map. I just wanted to show a couple maps. That this is from Bruce Catton, The Final Fury, where, it's one of the few books that I noticed that they show Pipe Creek along on the map. I don't know exactly what roads are trying to show here. I'd imagine this is Westminster, and this is Taneytown, and this is 97. So, imagine what they're trying to show there. They don't even show the right amount of roads. But I like it because it shows the Northern Army kind of advancing and the tentative defensive position. I should mention that there's a lot of negativity surrounds General Meade. And I think, and obviously the negative General Meade discussion is mostly about General Meade after the battle and the perceived notion that the Northern Army could have destroyed Robert E. Lee's army after the battle and missed a golden opportunity. So that's where a lot of this comes from. But then they push it and attach it to everything General Meade does. And the people who are critical of General Meade are unwilling to give him the success or credit for the things that he does do. They make it, it wasn't him, somebody else did this, or this didn't really affect anything, and that kind of irritates me. And of course, I don't want to pick on any individual people about what they write about the battle. Not my thought process. But I do have to mention one, and that's at Gelso. And that the last invasion, or whatever it's called. I don't even remember what it's called. I shouldn't say that. I have it on my shelf, and I have it all marked up. But there's two things in the book that really, really rub me the wrong way. He takes some quotes from Meade to his wife, takes like 4 different letters, takes a few words out of each one, puts them into a quote that makes it sound as if General Meade's a traitor to his country. And I think I think it's not too masked. I think in the book, he gives you the impression General Meade's a traitor. And then the thing about it is, he says when General Meade takes command, he retreats the army to Big Pipe Creek. And of course, he takes command in Frederick, and Big Pipe Creek is not, I don't see how that's a retreat. But it really upsets me, some of the things that he insinuates about General Meade. Now, here's a map. And this map is one where in the book it's really small. So you have to make a copy of the map and then blow it up to use it in any kind of discussion. But this is Edwin Coddington, A Study in Command. And you can see the time frame we're talking about and the movements shown on the map. It's very detailed. I should have looked for it. I have one when I was a kid. I copied it, and then I colored the different lines in different colors so you could see where the troops are moving. Oh, does he show Finksburg? Let's see. Because I haven't even thought about that until, somebody asked. Oh, Frizzleburg. Finksburg's another Adams County town. Frizzleburg. He does have it on the map. Good. Uniontown and Frizzleburg. Good. Very good. Probably because it's whoever drew it, it's mentioned. Whoop, what happened there? Okay, that wasn't supposed to be. Okay, there it is. So the second part of this map, it's on 2 pages, is the Confederate movements prior to the battle. So I just wanted to show that. Now, the troops did have to make these marches, and some of these marches are just, ridiculous. And, I guess by the time of the Gettysburg campaign, the troops are used to marching. So to tell people that they're marching on an average of 20 miles a day for several days, or that one unit might be required to march a greater distance sounds insane a little bit, but it's something that they were doing during the campaigning that the men were better at. In the beginning of the war, these marches could not have occurred. They just would not have been able to do it. And obviously, along the line of march, men are falling out, men are dying of, there's people dying of sunstroke, and, it's tough. But it's also hard to find illustrations of troops marching. So, it's fascinating to me in that sense. Let's see. The 16th Maine, for instance, they were in Middletown, over the Catoctin Mountains from Frederick. And I guess it was on June 29th, and they were ordered back to Frederick the night of 28th, 29th. So they marched from Middletown over to Frederick. And then when they got to Frederick, the 1st Army Corps was marching towards Emmitsburg, and they marched all the way to Thurmont that night. So they ended up marching 40 miles. And I just think, wow. The 16th Maine, that was just one regiment of the 1st Army Corps. I like that illustration from Hardtack and Coffee. And, the 5th Corps, I do a whole program on the March of the 5th Corps, and I've kind of lined it out. They march about 60 miles in like 3 days. So, and there's their line of march from Frederick to Liberty to Johnsville to Union Bridge over to Uniontown, and then they actually passed through Frizzleburg. That's Frizzleburg there, and then Pleasant Valley and over there. Now, I was going to mention that one thing's really confusing. I don't know if you guys have had this issue. When I first moved up, when I was like 12 from Baltimore, in the area of Frederick and Carroll County, there's Union Bridge, Uniontown, Union Mills, Unionville. And when you're reading about the campaign and the people don't even know the names of the towns, it's kind of confusing. But here I just kind of showed the 5th Army Corps on maps, how they move out of Frederick, and this is Google Maps, how they move up through Union Bridge and Uniontown and Frizzleburg and Pleasant Valley and then over to Union Mill Homestead. And on this one, I kind of show there's Union Bridge that they pass through. There's the Western Mail and Railroad Museum is right there, and they have a wayside exhibit that talks about the march. And then this would be Muttontown, which is no longer around on maps, and Uniontown. And then from Uniontown, they go over this weird side road that leads over to Frizzleburg, and then they go to Pleasant Valley. Spent a lot of time in Pleasant Valley as a youth. Now, there's a map in a book called Just South of Gettysburg, Carroll County in the Civil War, and this guy actually drew the Union line of march as they went through Pleasant Valley and up Halter Road and across Brown Road to Union Mills. He also has Jeb Stuart passing through the area the day before on the map, which I always thought was interesting. So if you see that book around, I think it's by Frederick Klein Shriver is the editor of the book. Just south of Gettysburg, Carroll County in the Civil War, has this extraordinary map in it of the march through Carroll County. And then, they spent a night at Union Mills Homestead. And for those of you who need a reference, this is where, Joshua Chairman would be in his tent where, Sergeant Kilrain wakes him up and says, hey, we're going to get ready to march. And then that's where they have the quote about, man being the killer angel in the book. But so then they marched to, the 5th Army Corps marches to Hanover on July 1st. And the plans were there for them to rest on July 1st. And remember, if the Pipe Creek Circular occurred, they might have to fall back, at that situation. But they moved to Hanover on July 1st, and then they get word the battle's at Gettysburg, and they have to continue the marching until they get near Bonneville, and they just kind of fall asleep about 2 o'clock in the morning. The next day, they end up moving to Gettysburg to help concentrate the force there. But they're not the only one of the corps. I just happened to do a program on them, and they're not the only corps that had a severe march. And of course, I'm talking about the 6th Army Corps. In a campaign that was marked by long and tedious marching, the men of the Greek Cross put forth one of the most extraordinary efforts of the entire war. The march of the 6th Army Corps to reach the field of battle on July 2nd, 1863, is the stuff that legends are made of. And it's understandable that those who participated in the march are very proud of their achievement in their post-war recollections. And again, I think some of this has been downplayed over the years because, no one wants to hear someone say, yes, we made the greatest march. And of course, because the Sixth Corps were not heavily engaged in the Battle of Gettysburg, their role in the battle is overlooked. James L. Bowen of the 37th Massachusetts asserted that it was one of the most famous marches known to all of military history. William Ray of the 23rd Pennsylvania recalled one of the grandest marches in history, either ancient history or modern history. Abraham Brewer of the 61st Pennsylvania noted that the movement of the Sixth Army Corps on July 2nd are such as to challenge the admiration of all mankind. Its majestic tread onto the battlefield at the supreme moment after such a memorable march will resound through the ages. I love that stuff. But again, because they're not heavily involved in the battle, there's a tendency to diminish their role in the overall Union victory. Now, this is unfortunate because their timely arrival, the head of the column pulling into near Rock Creek on the Baltimore Pike about 2:30, allowed General Meade to pull the 5th Army Corps out of reserve at Rock Creek and send them to the southern edge of the battlefield where Meade thought there would be a threat. And I should mention that General Meade does this prior to learning, about the same time he learned that Sickles had to move forward, but prior to the southern attack. Have you ever noticed? And again, I would be critical of people who write about the battle who don't give Meade credit for this. You ever notice when we're talking about Little Round Top, General Warren gets on Little Round Top and he's like, wow, they're going to attack this hill. We don't have any troops. I got to get troops. And then couriers ride down the bottom of the hill and there's Vincent's brigade there at the bottom of the hill. And they order Vincent's brigade to the top of the hill. And then, of course, Weed's brigade to the top of the hill and they hold Little Round Top. But seldom does anyone mention that the only reason Vincent's brigade's at the bottom of the hill and Weed's brigade's there is because General Meade had ordered them out of reserve on Rock Creek, and they appeared at that moment, at that critical time. And further, he only ordered them out of reserve because the 6th Army Corps had arrived after a 32 march during 17 hours. So this march, how can you deny? That's a quote from remember last Monument Monday. How can you deny that this didn't have something to do with the overall victory of the battle? So think about that when you see these 6 Corps monuments around the battlefield. There's one last thing I wanted to mention, that the Northern Army, for the first time, they feel in the war, you could argue the Antietam campaign, they're marching through friendly territory. The beginning of the march, they're marching up from Frederick through northern Maryland that is filled with, northern sentiments. These are not pro-Southerners. And the people of Johnsville and Union Bridge and Uniontown, they come out with large picnic baskets, and they have water, troughs and buckets for the soldiers as they're marching along the road, and they're singing to the soldiers as they go by. And the soldiers remark about this and write about this, and it really helps their enthusiasm during these long marches and keeps them going. And I don't think enough can be said about that. And then, of course, when they reach Pennsylvania, it's even a more welcome reception. So, and of course, that's our, the thing we like to talk about here. The march of the 5th Army Corps from Hanover to Gettysburg late in the evening of July 1st, there's account after account after account of the soldiers interacting with the civilians along the route and how good it made them feel. And also, you might think about, as these troops are on these marches, it was common to put the regimental bands at the front of the column to play, music for the soldiers as they marched along to encourage them. So while, musicians are really not in the battle and they don't play a major impact in the battle, the musicians, along with each of these regiments, play an important role in the march to Gettysburg. Okay, well, I think that's all I have for you. I want to thank everybody for coming.